Hello, and welcome to another episode of Wide Awake Politics. It is Friday, December 20th, 2024. Oh my goodness. First off, I can't believe it's already December 20th. And secondly, I can't believe 2024 is almost over. It doesn't make any sense anymore. Time does not make any sense. But there's still a lot left to happen between now and the end of the year, whether it be, just in regular life or in the world of politics. So let's get to regular life first. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah. Happy Festivus for the rest of us. All of those things. So Merry Christmas and happy, whatever it is you celebrate. So now let's talk about the world of politics. A lot of things been happening over the last, couple weeks since we talked last, since the last 72 hours, 24 hours, 8 hours. A lot of things have been happening, and we'll get into some of them. But like we like to do here on Wide Awake Politics is we do like to take one issue, kind of break it down, and give us some historic context for it. And what we are going to talk about today, and a lot of that discussion is going to be centered on the Department of Education. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to deep dive into that. I know we'll get into some continuing resolution or CR stuff. You may have heard it called the omnibus. We will get into that. We're going to maybe talk about drones. I don't know. It's not a big deal. But whatever. May spend a little bit of time talking about a post-Assad Syria. Just kind of wrap up last episode's quick note on that. But I think we should get into the Department of Education and why I feel like it's an important discussion topic. There's been a lot of information put out recently about the Department of Education as far as getting rid of it completely. What does that mean? There's a lot of confusion, I think, about what it is the Department of Education does. So we're going to talk about that. And so I think the first thing we need to do is talk about the history of it. So we're going to go back to 1867. So 1867, the Department of Education was first spoke about, right? So there was a lot of stuff before that, but Department of Education was termed in 1867. And you might say, hey, I think the Department of Education is a lot newer than that, and you would be correct. But we're gonna go back and kind of tell you the history of why it's kind of transformed from what it was then all the way to what it is now, and give that history on why we probably shouldn't repeat the past, and why this current iteration of where we're at currently is probably the best place to be. So 1867 Department of Education was put into place, or tried to be put into place, and what its goal was to collect information and statistics around the country. And how do they do that, and what does that mean? So basically, they utilize the U.S. Census. So every 10 years, you get a knock on your door, you get some emails, and relentless about answering these questions, right? And on there, they'll have questions like, what is your highest education level? When's the last time you went to school? And it changes every census. How many hours did you work? And then if you go back into like the 1800s, you can look at the census then and you can kind of see where they're pulling information from. So based off of what they're getting from the census and based off of those questions, they can figure out, okay, what parts of America have high dropout rates, have high graduation rates, have high literacy rates, things like that, right? Like if you go back into the 1800s, you can look on the census and say, can you speak English? Like, what is your first language? Because we are a nation built on immigrants, right? And they'll ask what your first language is, and those kind of things. Are you literate? Can you speak English? Like those are all types of things. And they're able to pull that information and provide it to the other states and to your own states and to the federal government to say, hey, this is what we're seeing in different sections of America across different economic boundaries. And this is where we're getting better results. And they can take that information and as a department and then take it and then disseminate it out to the other states and say, hey, these are the best ways that we're seeing education successes, right? And it may be the fact that in the lower economic regions is they just don't have the funding in order for these programs to succeed, or they need to get out of school faster in order to provide money for their family. Okay, how can we offset those costs? And they can get all of that information from things like the census. So that's why it's important. I'm just going to throw that out there. Make sure you fill that out correctly and accurately. It's super important for simple things just like funding for these kind of things. So, and we'll talk about how that kind of all of that actually just builds to where it is today. So 1867, Department of Education, it was actually not made into a department. They actually demoted it to what is known as an Office of Education. And why would they demote something? Because, and tell me if you heard this one before, there was a fear of government overreach and federal control of local schools. So there's a lot of fear being stoked, a lot of misinformation being put out there, a lot of fear mongering being put out there that's saying, if you let these schools, if you let the federal government into your schools, then they're going to teach your kids all of this stuff and then they're going to come out, It was just different rhetoric back then, but it was the same thing, right? It was the same type of fear mongering. So let's think about 1867. Why would that fear be so strong enough to where they cared about a education department? So 1867, we're 2 years removed from the Civil War. The Civil War ran from 1861 to 1865 in this country. And no matter what your viewpoint is on the Civil War, the facts of the matter are the Civil War was fought for the southern states to have the ability to have people as property. And that means they wanted to continue the institution of slavery without any interference from the government. Specifically, what they were really upset about was the fact that if any of their slaves ran away to the north, they wanted northern states. They wanted the federal government to ensure northern states gave back their property, their people as property. That was actually what was the law and what the northern states actually agreed to for a while as our nation was, being put together. It was kind of a compromise in order for us to form a nation, was for the northern states to kind of look the other way at slavery, the institution of slavery. And for a while, the northern states were required to send back any runaway slaves and return them back to their owners. Again, people. So the southern states did not like that. They did not like the federal government telling them that people are not property. And if you don't believe me in that, then I would encourage you to look up at any of the secession documents of your state or any of the southern states. Almost all of them contain the words the institution of slavery as being one of the keys and the reasons why, and the most important reason why, that they actually seceded from the Union, right? So you can have your feelings on that matter, or you can have discussions grounded in fact. Now, just because the war ended in 1865 did not mean those sentiments did not go away. The war may have ended, the fighting may have stopped on the battlefield, but the fight in the minds of Americans was still strong as far as fear of government overreaching in any way, whether it be for people to be property or for things like the Department of Education trying to give you funding for lower educated areas. Now, I also want to ensure that we're setting the stage here correctly. Whenever I say northern versus south, I'm putting a lot of people, grouping a lot of people into the same categories here. There were southern white people that fought for the Union, and not for intentions of equality, but for the fact that they felt like the institution of slavery was preventing poor white people from getting jobs. So after 1865, and while the institution of slavery went away, equality, like people did not have their mindset on equality. The vast majority of people still did not believe that African Americans were equal to them. I mean, you can see how that story has progressed even to times today, civil rights in the 1960s. And on, right? So I want to make sure that is put that into context as well, is that the fact that there are still there was a lot more people that were still hesitant over federal overreach than just the fact that slavery as an institution or states' rights, or however you want to kind of spin that. Anyway, so with all of that fear from the Congress and the everyday citizens, the Department of Education became that Office of Education, right? So Office of Education means that it is not a department itself. It's going to sit in other agencies and under other departments. So funded, but underneath other departments, you're going to change hands a lot because of that. Because when you have a funded organization like education, any agency that feels like they have a say in it wants a piece of it. They're going to want a piece of it because they're going to be like, well, if you think about it, then it needs to sit under Health and Human Services. Or if you think about it, it should sit under Department of Justice. Or if you think about it, it should sit under Department of Interior, right? So all of these different federal agencies and departments are actually now vying, and depending on the administration, is vying for where they want this Office of Education. For a long time, it sat under what is now Health and Human Services. It was under Health, Education, and Welfare. But you also have to think about this time, Health and Human Services or Health, Education, and Welfare was much smaller of an agency. And as time has grown and as our country has grown, so has the services required of our nation to give back to our citizens, right? That we are required to give to our citizens. So Health and Human Services is now, 25% of federal spending at this point. And if you put the Department of Education inside of Health and Human Services at this point, it becomes another piece of a huge system that's already full of a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of mess. Whenever we talk about the incoming administration, they talk about, cutting red tape and cutting funding and cutting, all of the fraud, waste, and abuse that's currently happening in our government. I do agree that there's a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse that's happening within our government. I think we have a lot of stopgaps in place right now, and we have a lot of agencies in place that are supposed to be going into fraud, waste, and abuse. We don't need to create another one, which is just going to create more things. But anyway, to the point of, when you have something that's so important as education, you want to have its own department. It should not sit in multiple different agencies. And I say all that, and I referenced Health and Human Services. I referenced Department of Interior. I represent the Department of Justice. I talked about all of these things because in Project 2025, Chapter 11, Department of Education, they specifically talk about breaking down the Department of Education and putting them in all of these different areas. They want to talk about Title I whenever we talk about civil rights, equalities, all of these things, providing funding for our poorest communities and our the people that need it the most. We talk about Title I to ensure that is happening, and we talk about all of the different equality titles that go into place, Title 11, Title 9. They want to put under Department of Justice, Department of Interior. They want to put for all Native American schools. They wanted to put under Department of Interior. They want to put anything for, these are all of the different areas that they want to put. For military, they wanted to put under DOD. When you start breaking these things down, then you start losing the thread, right? And that's whenever fraud, waste, and abuse actually happens. Now, I also just want to jump in here real quick and say that 90% of your funding for education comes from your state. Only 10%, and sometimes even as low as 8% of funding for education comes through the federal government. Again, most funding, almost all of your funding is through the state. It is not through the federal government. The federal government's funding is specifically for making sure that our lowest, our people who need it the most are getting equal access to education, right? So we'll get into more of that, but I just want to set the scene on all of that, right? So Office of Education, again, it's going to change hands over the time, over different administrations, different departments, different agencies want it. So 1917 well, I skipped one in 1890. There was another big act that occurred, Second Morrill Act, which gave the Office of Education the right to administer funding for land grant usage for colleges and universities. So basically, it gave them another mission to say, hey, during this time in our nation's history, we're expanding. We're expanding greatly in the 1890s. We're expanding west, but at the same time, our education is still kind of set up for, these Ivy League schools, these East Coast, you have to be in the highest class in order to get into these colleges and universities. Well, as we're expanding west, we also need to make sure that we have institutions in place to have facilities across our nation for higher learning, for colleges and universities. And one of the things that stands in the way a lot is real estate, right? Land. So the Office of Education was given the authority to administer land grants for colleges and universities across. So instead of being strictly like East Coast, Northeast, like highly educated there, you have that expanded across the United States. And what that does on a couple different levels, right, is instead of an extreme like East Coast, Northeast perspective on business and things like that, then as you move colleges and universities to different areas of America and different areas of agriculture and industry, you get a whole different perspective on those things, right? So that's why it's important to have that representation there and different things. So that's extremely important to have. So I wanted to push that one out. And so these next few are going to be very an intense discussion on different things. So in 1917, the Smith-Hughes Act, it was funding for vocational schools. So this allowed the Office of Education to start funding vocational schools and allowing putting funds out there from grants for different states. So we have to kind of, again, set the scene where we're at in the world. World War I, 1917, we're sending folks off to, men off to war in Europe. They're coming home broken, mentally, physically, or not at all. And that leads to a lot of different things that happen in our time. But before we get into that hard piece, I want to talk about vocational schools for a second. So Smith-Hughes Act authorized that funding for vocational schools. I love vocational schools. I love the idea of education being funded in high schools for vocational jobs. I want to shout out the school I went to growing up, Orangefield ISD. I was actually in town earlier this year actually, for a death in the family, and I happened to get to go to a school function there, and they had their seniors. They were recognizing a lot of their seniors for when they graduate, they're going to have different types of degrees and certificates and stuff. And so you had people ranging from getting their cosmetology license already to going to and getting some nursing certificates or some. I grew up in an area that's really heavy in refinery, whether it be for oil and gas or chemicals, different things. So refining and working at the plants is it's a very big industry in that area, and they pay good money, right? So it can be difficult to get in the door. So these programs there in that area are centered around ensuring that there's internships, there's head starts into the college programs, because a lot of those jobs do require like a 2-year degree, which I think is great. And they partner with a lot of the local colleges and stuff. And I just think that it was so great to see, because not everybody's meant to go to college, right? My generation, the millennial, the elder millennials of the world, we were told that the only next logical step is to go to college, right? I think there was an episode of Everybody Loves Chris or something like that, where they're sitting there and the teacher's like, if you don't learn this math, then you're going to be a garbage man. You're not going to be able to get into college, and then you're going to be a garbage man. And then the guy's like, nobody told me the garbage man worked in a union and he's got good benefits. And, and it's like, nobody told us that. And I don't blame anybody for that. And I don't think it was like some sort of like big conspiracy. I honestly think that, everybody just wanted what's best, and the best thing that everybody was told is to go to college, right? And that is a good thing. It is. I always say education is the best, but some people just, that's not the next step for them, and that's okay. And so I see these kids now, same ones that I saw, getting their cosmetology licenses or whatever, and they are post graduation, and they are heels, feet to the ground working, and they are making it, and they're doing great things. And that is what it is sometimes. Sometimes they're ready to go, and they're ready to start that next phase. And sometimes sometimes kids aren't, and they want to go to college, or they want to take a gap year or whatever. Just always just keep learning, whatever that means. But I do appreciate vocational schools and vocational programs. Again, most of them are funded by your states, but I do want to shout that out because I think it's important. I also keep up with them through social media, their social media posts, and they always are talking about, whether it be, I talk about the refining and all cosmetology and stuff, but then they have business classes for, their high school kids, and these kids are getting their Microsoft Word, certificates, and all of these things that are going to prepare them for, life in, the business field, if that's what they want to go into. And it's just, it's good to see. And it's good to see the kids taking advantage of it and taking it seriously. And I'm really happy to see that. And I hope that is a model for them. And I know that the administration has to be working hard on that. So just great shout out. Orangeville doing great things with that. So, and I don't know all the story. So if they're not if there's something really bad happening, I don't know. But again, I think the superintendent was a student teacher whenever I was in high school. And from what I've seen outside looking in, the vocational work alone has just been amazing. So great job there. So now we're going to get into, though, 1917 to the very next lesson, which is in 1941, the next act. So a lot of stuff happened in our world during that time. Again, World War I, these people came home, and then soldiers came home, again, broken on a lot of different levels, which caused a lot of Americans to rethink of our place in the world. Similarly, probably to what a lot of Americans are thinking right now. And it's like, well, why are we taking care of all of these other people, right? And we should just be worried about ourselves. And they talk about isolationism, and that's what happened after World War I in America. The vast majority of Americans wanted isolationism. They wanted to take care of our own, right? Like we weren't doing that before. And they did not want to be involved in any more conflicts. And you know what? I after the scale of World War I can understand people having those feelings, but especially when you add on that we had a stock market crash, we had the Great Depression happening. There was food insecurity around America, whether it be if you could be extremely rich one day and you could have nothing the very next, or you could be extremely poor and just getting by doing work in the fields or whatever that you have to do. And then the next day you're not getting paid, and you're still having to do all of that work, in hopes that you might get some food or might get food or enough money to get a loaf of bread. And so there was a lot of issues happening during that time, for everybody, on a scale that a lot of people hadn't seen before, right? So we have to also think about that. So all of that played into the role of the fact that we were very much a country that felt like we needed to be isolated and we need to take care of ourselves and we don't need to be taking care of everybody else's stuff. Have you heard this before? Right? So then came FDR. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt came into office, and he is a man that came from great privilege, right? He's got the name Roosevelt. He's highly educated, Ivy League educated, extreme wealth, and he's now he's a governor of New York, sitting president at that point, and says, We need to lift everybody up, whether it be through educate, whether we got to get programs in place to ensure that we all as Americans have food on the table. We don't have to worry about that. And we are educated, and that we are all working on the same playing field. It is not, I want to make sure that it's clear on that, is it's not, the priorities were not to bring people down. And it's not, whenever I talk about equality and I talk about equity and we talk about ways to ensure that people are all on the same playing field, it's never about bringing these people down, right? It's about bringing these people up. When we talk about education and we talk about society and equality in the workplace and those things, we're talking about evening it, not going bring these people down. No, let's all be here. Let's all live here. That would be awesome, right? The vast majority of us all living here. That'd be cool. Anyway, but so FDR came in, extremely wealthy. He's getting so much crap from his society, going, why do you care about these people? Why are you pushing for this equality? Why are you trying to, bring these people up? It was a lot of that. He was getting a lot of that. And I think that you have to understand that, and I think that we get kind of disillusioned with politics and everybody, where everybody thinks that all politicians are bad. All politicians, I don't believe that. I don't believe all politicians are bad. I think that there are some, just like there's crazy people in every single segment of every, whether it be religion, whether it be career, cops, whatever segment of society you can imagine. There's a small group of people that are terrible. They're terrible humans. And they're usually the loudest, and they usually get the most publicity. And a lot of times, we as a whole can be trusted to just ignore them. But right now we're not, and it's driving me crazy. But I digress, right? When people talk about all politicians being bad, I look at FDR and I think that he had so much privilege, and he became president, and he did not fight for the elite. He fought for ensuring people had food on the table. He really went and made sure that he tried to make sure groceries were affordable. And by affordable, he tried to make sure that people just had it. So, those are some of the things. And I also want to point out that while we're talking about, at this point, the Office of Education is under Health, Education, and Welfare, now Health and Human Services. I also want to bring up that FDR was, again, a man of privilege. He had, would run around, and he was extremely active, athletic. And he went for a swim one day when he was older, when he was an adult. And he came in and he said, I don't feel well. And then the next day he woke up and he was paralyzed. He had polio. I don't think I need to connect the dots of Health and Human Services today to trying to get rid of childhood vaccines, to polio, to FDR. Anyway, I don't know why I'm bringing that up, but just in case. But whenever FDR was unable to inspect, this is how much he was serious about it, right? He didn't stand for lip service. Like, you could tell him, sir, whenever he was governor of New York or president, you go to different institutions to check him out. We're giving all of our inmates or patients this meal, right? This is their menu. This is everything they're getting fed and everything. And after he became paralyzed, he could not go and inspect the facilities like he wanted to. So he actually trained Eleanor, his wife, to do it. So the first lady would go, and she said on one of the first trips, she went out there to this prison. They told her everything that they were serving. Oh, that's great. And she said she went and met FDR, and he said, Okay, that's great. Did you check? And she said, what are you talking about? He said, well, they told you everything that they were feeding them, but did you lift up the top of the tray? And she said, no. So she learned that lesson that day. And I think it's a lesson that kind of like sits with me, is the trust but verify. I think Reagan said that later, right? But he was serious. It wasn't about lip service. You can tell me all day long that that's what you're serving them, but lift up that tray. Make sure that what you're saying is what's actually happening. That's how much he paid attention. And that's how much Eleanor paid attention after, being, after he schooled her up on it. But if you haven't read anything on FDR or Eleanor Roosevelt and their partnership while he was president or governor, it's incredible. But anyway. So yeah, all of that was happening. FDR was advocating for that. And again, we were extremely in an isolationist perspective, right? Now, that was 1917 was that first one we talked about with the vocational schools, World War I, Great Depression, the New Deal, a lot of reforms being put in place by FDR. And then in 1941, the Lanham Act was put into place, and it provided payments for school districts to ease burdens to communities affected by military installations. And you say, hey, you just said that we were isolationists, so why in 1941 would we be needing to provide payments to school districts to ease burdens for military installations? Well, let me tell you. So, obviously, our military, when we were in an isolationist period, was we scaled it down tremendously. So we were actually pretty far down the list, probably like, I want to say in the teens, by the time Hitler took over Europe. So when Hitler invaded and took over all and conquered Europe, if we wanted to get in the fight and try to help, even if we wanted to at that point, we couldn't. We didn't have the military strength. We didn't have the equipment. We didn't have anything. Because again, Congress, based off of the sentiment of the American people and based off of, the issues of funding at that point, they did not want anything to do with military anything at that point. So when Hitler actually invaded Europe, FDR was kind of stuck. He did not, he found a great way to, and it's controversial, but I think it's pretty ingenious if you ask me, to help the war effort without having to send troops, which may be something that we're trying to do in certain countries today, right? A way to help in order to not send our own troops and in order to prepare us in case we do have to, right? So from the time that Hitler took over Europe, he made an agreement with Great Britain. FDR made an agreement with Great Britain that said, we are going to lend you military equipment and arms. You don't lend military equipment and arms for nothing. And we're just going to call it a lend and lease kind of program. So basically, it enabled FDR to pump up military funding, pump up military installations, pump up, making sure that we are building aircrafts and bombs and all of these things from the time Hitler invaded and until actually Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. At that point, again, we were just sending arms over to Great Britain. That way, it eventually went to the USSR after the Germans, the Nazis turned on USSR, who was working with them at that point. And then the Soviets ended up, fighting with us on the Allied forces because they had to. But we did the same thing with them. We did the lend and lease program with them for a little bit. And we did send some aviators over to Great Britain at that point as well, and some other things, but not on the grand scale of what was happening during World War I. That was until the Japanese surprise attacked Pearl Harbor. And I want to just remind you that we were so isolationist that even after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, that FDR knew he couldn't get a war declaration in Europe and against the Germans. So he only went and asked for a declaration of war against Japan and into the Pacific at that point. However, the determination of war in Europe for America was actually made by Germany, because Hitler went on and provoked and declared war on America, right? Because of the Japanese declaring war. It just kind of, he thought it was the best way to kind of help out that situation. Whenever I talk about he, I meant Hitler in that specific regard, whatever. We all know how that worked out for him. America. Right. So luckily, FDR did look into the future when Europe was taken over by Hitler, and he got us into a position to where we could fight, and we did have arms, and we were able to move forward. I also want to just put out there that I was walking around one of the history museums, American History Museum in DC the other day, and they have a lot of beautiful resources, right? And one of the things that I did see was they even had the homemakers saving grease from meals, saving fats and grease in order to make weapons. So your parents, whenever they would make food, they would save their grease and then bring it to the War Department. That's how involved we were. That's how involved Americans' day-to-day life was involved in the war. So we talk about sacrifices and different things. I think about, I'm reading again The Greatest Generation by Tom Brokaw. You think about the sacrifices that people made during that time against Hitler in America. I mean, you had women going down to give bacon grease, it's amazing. It's amazing to me, the sacrifices people were willing to make at that point to ensure freedom and democracy around the world. And then today, I want my grocery prices to be lower. I do too. So do I, but I also want democracy. Anyway. All right. So, cool. So, again, those communities with the military installation. So whenever they needed those payments, so let me just explain that real quick. So why would communities need payments for their school districts? New military installations had to be built. So new places had to be built, new institutions, installations for all of the equipment, all of the people, personnel, all of these things, staging locations. So with that came families, right? So all these families moving into places that they hadn't been before. And a lot of these places that had new military installations may not have the infrastructure to handle all of these new people coming in, to include their children coming into the school districts. So the Lanham Act allowed the federal government to provide payments to ease that burden on school districts, which I think is a pretty good and fair deal. So then you had, obviously, we fought in World War II. And then in 1944, after that, the GI Bill was enacted. So the GI Bill is one of the greatest pieces of legislation I think this country has passed in a long time that has really helped out people, to include myself. So the GI Bill provides post-secondary education assistance at that point to World War II veterans. So you also want to think about that during World War II, we had a draft, but there was a lot of people that volunteered to go fight against the Nazis and fight for freedom and democracy around the world. And they had to put their lives on hold. Many voluntarily. They put their lives on hold, whether it be to go to college, to start their next phase of their life, to start a family, all of those things, to do that. So when they came back, if they came back, right? Because there was a lot of people that didn't. If they came back, then they were entitled to benefits, and one of those benefits being post-secondary education. It has kind of evolved over time. It's used a couple different names, but GI Bill's always usually been in the title. When I went through the military, I enlisted in 2008. It was under the Montgomery GI Bill, so I actually paid $100 a month for the first year of my enlistment. So $1,200 got me full access to benefits for my education. I could go and get a degree after the military and have it paid for by you, the taxpayer, through the Montgomery GI Bill. Now, that has evolved since then to what's known as the post 9/11 GI Bill. It does not require monetary payment plan into. So I think for a while at the from the GI Bill that was after World War II to after the Vietnam period and everything else, it was besides like the Gulf War and a few conflicts here and there wasn't a huge long conflict that occurred, right? So they felt like it was more of an entitlement that you pay into to get. But then after 9/11, they realized like, hey, we put our lives on the line. We spent a lot of time in deployed locations. Same thing as some of these other vets, so we should give that benefit to them. You obviously have to serve. There's time limits on it for different things, for active duty members versus National Guard versus reserve members versus members who are 100% disabled. Those are all time requirements. It does provide a certain time period to utilize it. I think it's like 36 months of education benefits, but it's all about when and how you use it. So like, for instance, I go to a college that does 8-week semesters. So instead of a semester being 16 weeks, 4 months, now I've got it down to 2. So I can get in double the amount of classes that somebody going to a normal university would. And that's of my choosing. It also means that my courseware is accelerated. I can handle that. And maybe some classes I can't. So maybe some classes I do 16 weeks versus 8 weeks. All of that ties into the 36 months. I think it's 36 months. Don't quote me on it. I don't have the information right in front of me. But the total time. Now, because I'm doing it on accelerated weeks, I can also get the most bang for my buck, meaning I've gotten multiple degrees out of my GI Bill. I'm actually going to finish another full bachelor's degree with the remaining GI benefits that I have. So that's super important to me. One of the other great benefits of post 9/11 GI Bill is the fact that we get what's known as BAH, or housing allowance. So if I am a full-time student, then I also receive a benefit, a monthly stipend for housing allowance. I go to an online university at this point because it just works better for me. For my post, I won't go to an online, but for my bachelor's degree right now, I'm going to an online school. So I get half of the nationwide average for BAH for a staff sergeant. And that's just what it is. So I could live anywhere in the world and get that same amount. Now, if I were to go in to school and be in person for any of those classes, if I were to do that, then I would get what's known as full BAH. So I would get basically double what I'm making now going to school. Now, again, that's not a full-time, you get that forever. It's for a specific period of time. You can use that for a variety of different programs, and I wanted to make sure that people know that. So you can use it, obviously, for college degrees like bachelor's, associates, higher, vocational technical training, right? On-the-job apprenticeship training, flight training, correspondence training, work study, tuition assistance top-off. There's also like a one-time, if you live in like a super rural area, they'll pay for you like $500 for relocation. Well, it's not a lot. It's still $500. So just there's a lot of good benefits. And I am a person that likes structure. I am a person that achieved a lot in high school, but needed structure afterwards. And I wasn't ready to do it on my own. So I kind of messed around for 4 years and then joined the military and excelled. And I needed that structure. And my whole world has changed based off of the military. My whole viewpoint of the world has changed based off the military. I've lived all over this country. I've lived from living in a small Southeast Texas town to then, going to, living in California for a year, to where it was like, California, like that's where I grew up. That's how I grew up. Like, people in California are crazy. I lived there for a year. I got a whole new perspective on that. I lived in Florida for 9 years, but during that time I traveled to Europe and Japan, and I spent a lot of time in the Middle East and a lot of time in Africa. And I've traveled, and it's just been amazing to be able to do. And I've lived in Colorado, I got to see how that works, politics between, California, Texas, Florida, right? I would lived in Matt Gates's district. I mean, come on. To Colorado, living in Denver, that's a whole nother world, especially in Colorado, it's, pretty rural outside of Denver. And then you get into, I lived in Virginia for a year, and I got to see the politics of Northern Virginia, which is crazy. And then now living in Maryland, it's just so it's nuts. I actually really enjoy Maryland, so I don't have anything bad to say so far about Maryland, except that it drives me crazy whenever you are trying to become a Maryland resident and they make it so hard. But that's a story for another day. But I think they make it hard because you get a lot of good benefits from living in Maryland, and Maryland is a great state. Thank you very much, Westmore. All right. We're going to move right along. I don't think we're going very quickly, but we're getting through a lot of different topics. All right, so post 9/11, GI Bill, 1944, 1957. So if you know me, I am kind of a weirdo when it comes to space. If you look, there's a lot of space stuff around. Space is one of the most interesting things to me, but I hate it because it makes my brain hurt. I have a buddy that I used to work with, and he was going to school to be an astrophysicist. So we're having some really good conversations about space. But there's one part of space that, and it's probably it is a big part of it, but it's something that I'll never understand. It's like a lot of the space-time continuum. Like, I don't physically, like, my brain cannot understand it. He was explaining it to me one day, and I think it was the perfect illustration of watching somebody's mind be blown, because I fully had no control over the fact that he's telling me all this, and there are tears rolling down my eyes and rolling down my face because my brain could not handle understanding how, like, time can work in space. So I will fully admit to that. Space is cool. I think it's really neat. I like learning about it, but there's a limit to what my brain can handle, and now I know what it is, and it's that. So thanks, Angel. Yeah, so in 1957, though, a big event happened. Sputnik got launched from Russia. So Russia launched Sputnik into space, and everybody's like, that's so cool, space, right? And most normal people, everyday people are like, that's amazing. Most Americans are like, why didn't we do that first, right? But if you worked in science or you worked in the government, you said, oh, no. Because if they can launch that, they can launch a whole bunch of other stuff into space, right? And you also have to think it was a Cold War during that time between the Soviets and the U.S. So what did that launch do? It increased a whole lot of funding for space, for science, for technology, for education. And that really kicked off a lot of more funding being put in there. So it kicked off the 60s, right? So one of the big things that I like to talk about, and one of the big interesting points is the first live presidential debate, or the first televised presidential debate, right? And it was between then Senator John F. Kennedy and Vice President Richard Nixon. And it was in 1960. And first time it was televised. So they had radio listeners, but it was first time that you got to see it. And it actually played a big role, I think, to JFK being elected versus Nixon. But at the end of the day, you had two very intelligent men talking about politics, and they understood the politics of it. They understood every single thing, every single issue intimately. There's talks of whenever JFK and Richard Nixon would do these debates, they would travel by train, and they would travel together, and they would have conversations just talking about the issues. Like that's from 1960. That's where we were. And two characters such like JFK and Richard Nixon, you can say what you want to about their private lives and everything. And Richard Nixon's his very public impeachment and his resignation, right, from office, or his resignation from office, of what, they're willing to do and what they're willing not to do. But when they talk about the issues during the debate, you can see that how much they care and they understand what's going on. One of the biggest issues that they had during the 1960 debate for domestic issues was teacher salary. So there's a whole section where they talk about the need to do something about ensuring that teachers are getting properly compensated for what they're doing. Heard this one before? So this was 1960, right? These two men are having that discussion. And one of the things that it's one of those things I like to rewatch, because these two men did not lie to the American people or did not make you think that you were stupid. They told you the truth. And you saw that in a moment where there was a newsman. So basically during that debate, you had the two candidates on stage. You had a moderator in the middle, and then you had a panel right behind, like right in front of the cameras, of newsmen of all the agencies that the biggest news agencies that were around at that time. And they just kind of went down the row, and the newsmen could ask their questions of the candidates. And one of the questions one of the questions that were posed to JFK was, you want to have all of these social programs and education programs. How are you going to do that and still not add to the debt, or, help with the debt, or, change the deficit? And you can see the look of irritation on JFK's face. And he's like, I never said that we could cut the debt. There's no possible way we can cut the debt. When's the last time you heard a politician tell you the truth on something like that? A candidate for president tell you, we can't cut the debt. We can't do it right now. But the way that we can do it is by investing in our teachers, in all of these other industries, in order to pick these people up, make sure we still have a middle class, and give them the money necessary to lift them, right? And that lifts our economy. Well, that's why I find so interesting is the fact that he's like, I absolutely said we wouldn't cut the deficit. And Richard Nixon did the same thing. He's like, we can't do that. I mean, we just got out of this crisis. Like, we're not going to be able to cut it. But they both agreed that teachers need to get paid. Now, they had a different opinion on how to accomplish this. JFK's opinion was, he flat out said, property taxes cannot keep up with the wage for teachers, the proper wages for teachers, right? Proper compensation. So JFK's plan was to actually take and subsidize the salaries through government programs. Subsidize the salaries of teachers through government programs. Nixon's response to that was, the problem that you have with that is that then you can kind of you may have the issue of tying curriculum and what the teacher can and cannot teach to their salary, right? So I get it. There's things in place, obviously. And throughout, since 1960, we've seen some subsidy programs, troops, teachers, different other programs, internship programs, debt relief programs for tuition assistance. If you go work in this school district, in this lower income school district, you'll get paid this much, right? Which is a higher earning percentage than if you go into work in this better school district, right? Those programs are in place today, maybe not on the scale that it should be. But Richard Nixon's thought was, obviously, teacher salaries need to increase, but it would lead to those strings. So his idea was to strictly push through any type of school building funding through grants paid for by the federal government. To me, it doesn't it's all the same anyway. Like, if you're tying money to any type of school district, there could be fraud, abuse of power, that kind of thing, right? But both of those initiatives have been put into place in different ways. Obviously, teacher salary is still lacking. We still need to pay our teachers more. We still need to ensure that we are providing the best education outcomes for our students as possible. And we can talk soon about how we can do that. So that was 1960. And then in 1960s, Lyndon Johnson put a war on poverty. There was a lot of initiatives that included programs including education for poor students. And obviously during that time, the 1960s, there was civil rights acts that were put into place, which included different things like Title 11, Title 1, and things since then that's happened. So still at that point in the 60s, we were under the Office of Education. But then in October 1979, Congress passed the Department of Education Organizing Act, and it became public law, where the Department of Education began running in May of 1980. And so basically it combined all of the different offices at that point of the Office of Education, because you'd have the Office of Education in the Department of Interior, you'd have the Office of Education in Health and Human Services, you'd have the Office of Education in this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. Instead, it takes all of that and puts it under one roof, and it has one head, right? Instead of having, think about this, like if you're in a room and you're like, all right, so I have one boss. My boss is the leader of the Department of Education. Now, if you work into an office inside of another office inside of another department, how many bosses do you have? See where I'm going? So that's why we probably should have it under one roof. But what does the Department of Education do at this point? So we've gone through the history of it, why it's got organized, and some of the key factors, right? So Department of Education, what does it do? So it collects data, just like the beginning that we talked about in the 1800s. It collects data, oversees research on America's schools, and disseminates that information to Congress, educators, and the general public. You can go on their website right now, on the Education Department's website, and see all that information. It's also going to identify major issues and problems in education and focus national attention on them. It's one of the things they do. They'll go in front of Congress and tell you, here's some of the issues that we found. Here are the things that are going on. One of its main things is enforcing federal statutes prohibiting discrimination in programs and activities receiving federal funds, and ensure equal access to education for every individual. These things include Title I, Title IX, Title 11. So you're talking about preschool through college, civil rights policies, laws. That also includes individuals with disabilities. So the Department of Education is one that are going to be ensuring that funds are sent to different states for life skills. So people with developmental disabilities, people with mental handicaps, whatever terminology that your state utilizes to ensure people with disabilities, people that are different, have equal access to education. I know that there are programs out there that offer education for people with developmental delays that may have them going to their local high school until they're well into their adult period to learn life skills, things like that. Those programs are in place and they are insured by the Department of Education. So those are some of the biggest things. So what doesn't the Department of Education do? There are definitely things in there that it doesn't do. So if you want to know the law, go to section 103, Bravo, Public Law 9688. It says the department shall not exercise any direction, supervision, or control over the curriculum, program of instruction, administration, or personnel of any educational institution, school, or school system, over any accrediting agency or association, or over the selection of content of library resources, textbooks, or other instructional materials by any educational institution or school system, except to the extent authorized by law. So what does that mean? It means that the Department of Education does not establish schools or colleges. It'll give you land grants based off of the Second Morale Act. It does not develop curriculum. It does not set requirements for enrollment or graduation. And it does not determine state education standards or develop or implement testing to measure whether states are meeting their education standards. That is handled by your state. So if you have a problem with state testing, things like that, your curriculum, that is your state. That is not the Department of Education. So when we're having these conversations, make sure that you are referencing the fact that it is your state that are setting those requirements. When we talk about your local school boards, they're the ones talking about, banning CRT, and they're the ones that are going in and taking books out of public schools, right? They're the ones preventing all of this. They're not the ones the Department of Education is not doing it. It's your state. It's your local school boards. Go talk to them about it. If you don't agree with that stuff, go talk to them about it. One thing I will tell you, though, is President-elect Trump has actually talked recently about creating his own national college. Trump University was already a thing. It was not accredited because it couldn't get accredited. When we talk about accreditation, we're talking about, do they meet standards? Are they meeting basic educational standards? Are they following these titles? Like, what is happening for your states? All of this stuff. But the president-elect has come out recently after the election, has given a speech talking about how he wants to create a universal university for America. But you want to get rid of the Department of Education? What are we doing? What are we doing? If you want to know more about what the Department of Education does and does not do, I would recommend going to your education department website, looking there. There's lots of good information as we go through. You can look at their overview history. If you go to the U.S. Department of Education, there's actual laws and policies that you can actually look up on there. I'm looking at my screen while I'm scrolling through it. There's information on Pell Grants and scholarships, because that's a lot of what the Education Department does, is it sends out the money for your Pell Grants. The Congress allocates that money to the Department of Education. The Department of Education is able to then disseminate that money out based off of the national standards for Pell Grants, based off of what is needed to ensure that the people that need it the most, the people that need it the most are able to achieve and be able to have equal access to education, right? Those are the types of things. So you want to make sure that if you are looking for information, you can actually find it on the Department of Education's website. You can find actual laws there and read those through there. So a couple other things we want to talk about. How is the Department of Education organized? They have a Secretary of Education, right? They're nominated. They're presidentially nominated. They're Senate approved. We've been through that. They're a cabinet member. They're a principal advisor to the president on federal policies, programs, and activities related to education in the United States. Pretty simple, right? So our current secretary under the Biden administration is Dr. Miguel Cardona. So he was sworn in March 2nd, 2021. Didn't take long after the new Congress sat. He got a bachelor's degree from Central Connecticut State University in education, a master's with 2 additional leadership certificates, and a doctoral degree from the University of Connecticut. He spent 2 decades of experience as a public school educator from Meridian, Connecticut, where he served as an elementary school teacher there, where he grew up. He also served as the principal there. He led numerous initiatives and programs in Connecticut to help the most vulnerable children of Connecticut, like those with developmental delays. He ensured that they had all kinds of access to programs available in Connecticut. And he went on to serve as Commissioner of Education in Connecticut. So some of the things that during this last administration, since March 2nd of 2021 till he took the reins, there has been a lot of things that have happened with the Department of Education. And I just want to hit on some of his major areas of focus, right? So focus areas for Secretary Cardona included academic recovery and excellence post-COVID, improving conditions for educators and mental health, right? That's huge, I think, when we talk about mass shootings, school shootings. There's been a huge push for mental health, which I agree with. I also think that there should be, other things like, ensuring that there are better protections for, people with getting guns out of the hands of people who don't need them. But that's for another day as well. Again, but mental health is always important, I think, especially with the new age of technology. Our kids these days, they live in a whole new world, and that can't ever be shut off, right? We could used to be able to hang up the phone off of the receiver and we wouldn't get phone calls, and now it's just all the time, everywhere. So he wanted to improve that. Global competitiveness through career pathways, multilingualism, college affordability, and accessibility. So all of those things are super important. So how did they do? So Secretary Cardona under Secretary Cardona's leadership, we've seen the greatest one-year growth in reading achievement for our lower performers. So people that need it the most, that if you looked at the census information and they said, hey, based off our census data, these areas are seeing some of our lowest performance in reading and literacy. And the Department of Education was able to put resources and new programs and grants in place into those areas, and they saw the greatest one-year growth in that. I think that's important to note. There's 48 states that now offer programs to pay student teachers apprenticeship programs. So that allows people who want to either make a career change to be a teacher, or those that are going to be, straight out of college being teachers, when they have to do that internship and apprenticeship programs. Before, they weren't always paid for that. Now they can get paid. In 48 states, you can get paid while you're doing your apprenticeship. And that's huge. It's a big step. There's 16,000 additional school counselors and mental health experts around the country. There's 10% more Pell Grants awarded than last year. Now, I don't put that as like an achievement, because I think that the achievement would be to ensure that people don't need federal assistance. But it is important that we actually have that available for people who need it. I wish that, people didn't have to, pay for school, because, and there's been $175 billion in debt relief for over 5 million people during that time. That includes when we talk about student debt relief. Again, I talked a little bit about it earlier when we talked about elder millennial generation being like, you have to go to college. You're taking kids that you're telling them their life will be over before it even starts if they don't go to college, right? So then they go to college and they have no way to pay for it. Maybe they didn't qualify based off of their parents' income for Pell Grants. And then their parents won't pay for their college because they can't afford it, or they won't, right? And then they've been told, I have to go to college. So now they say, okay, well, I can get this grant, I can get this student loan, and it looks really great. And then now they've been out of school for 15 years. They took $30,000 in student loan debt, and they've paid it every single month since they've been out of school. And they, again, took $30,000, and now they're still paying $37,000. They still have $37,000 to spend on, and I take that as a real life example from somebody I know. So, that's why we say like it's unfair. What the Biden administration is doing with that $175 billion in debt relief is they're just throwing out any possible legal way to try to cancel out as much student loan debt as possible, knowing it's going to get challenged in court, knowing that it's going to get smacked down. But in that meantime, they still relieve that debt for those people. So probably not the best way to do it. And I probably wouldn't agree with it on any other issue besides, debt relief for average Americans. I think any kind of administration that is trying to relieve the debt of Americans is important. All right, so I kind of put off all of Dr. Cardona's big things there, his resume, to tell you now who the president-elect has chosen to nominate for Secretary of Education. Secretary of Education nominee Linda McMahon of WWE fame. She's 76 years old. She has a degree in French and a teaching certificate from East Carolina University. She never used the East Carolina University certificate because she went on to get married. No problem there. And to help run a massive organization in the WWE, which that's great. Good. She served as chief executive of WWE until 2009. In 2009, she served very briefly on Connecticut's Board of Education, where she promptly resigned to run for Senate in Connecticut. She ran twice in 2010, where she lost to Senator Blumenthal by 11%, and then lost again to Chris Murphy in 2012 by at least 8%. She spent nearly $100 million of her own money on that, so that was a good investment. She served as vice chair of Board of Trustees at Sacred Heart Private Catholic Institute, and donated $7 million to Trump's first campaign. During the first Trump administration, she was appointed Small Business Administrative Secretary. She was Senate approved with an 81-19 vote. I think that makes sense. She showed she donated $7 million to Trump's first campaign, so he found a spot for her in the cabinet under business, which she obviously excels at. The Senate confirmed her by a huge margin, 81-19. And during her tenure in the SBA, the budget was cut by 5%. One thing I will say is that she visited every single SBA building and office while she was the secretary. Again, that was a long time ago. That was a while back, and she is quite up there. She's getting up there as far as age goes for working. I don't have a problem with people getting older. I think that's just, it is what it is. But whenever you're trying to be a cabinet member in a Department of Education that has been put under fire, specifically by the president-elect, by saying that he wants to eliminate it completely, and by the Republicans in Congress. And when I say that even by the Republicans in Congress, I mean the fact that they've actually put bills in place to try to remove the Department of Education. So whenever I say that, I'm going to congress.gov right now, and I looked up legislation, and I just typed in Department of Education. And so introduced on November 21st of this year, Senator Mike Rounds, a Republican from South Dakota, the text of his Senate bill, he introduced Senate Bill 5384. The first line, it says, to abolish the Department of Education. And then it talks about putting all functions, programs, and authorities of the Secretary of Education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act shall be transferred to the Department of Health and Human Services. Each authority of the program of the Office of Indian Education of the Department of Education shall be transferred to the Department of the Interior. Impact Aid program under Title 8 of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act shall be transferred to the Department of Health and Human Services. Pell Grants should go to the Department of Treasury, and it goes on and on and on. Again, it's taking this entire thing and then doing what we've done in the past, is putting all of it into different offices and creating even more of a mess than is already in the government. And then the biggest thing that they want to do is this block grant. So that's the key right there, is the second part of Section 4 of this legislation that did not get passed, by the way. But it's the roadmap. You take that and you look at the Project 2025, Chapter 11, that was written by Lindsey Burke. A lot of these are the same. It's just reorganizing. And a lot of it tells you, we're going to keep all of the same people. So what are you getting rid of? You're going to have the same amount of people. You're just going to put them in different places. You're going to take it apart and put it there. But then if you get into this next section, they talk about block grants. So basically what this next administration wants to do is to take the 8 to 10% of funding that the federal government gives to fund your education in your state, the 8 to 10%. And they want to take it and not put any strings on it, because there are strings on it, right? Because based off of your title, the different titles you're following, whether it's civil rights or anything else, and whether it be people with disabilities, children with disabilities, they say this is the people and the programs that you can utilize this funding for. For public school funding, this is what you can utilize this funding for. That's what the strings are. Now, when they say block grants, they're saying, here's this money with no strings attached. You can use it for whatever you want to. So whenever we go to places like Oklahoma, who now want to spend $3 million on Trump Bibles to put into your public school, that's a block grant. I can figure out a way to tie that to Title I. That's what they do. So some of the things that they've been trying to say over the time is Linda McMahon, actually, when she left the Small Business Administrator Secretary, she left there to take over and start the America First Policy Institute. So the America First Policy Institute is basically the transition team for the incoming Trump administration. She served as the co-chair for the Trump transition team. So there's that. She's a huge advocate with the America First Policy Institute on school choice, which is taking funding from public schools, taking your funding, your tax dollars from your public schools that you're providing for public schools, and equal education for all students. And they're saying that should just be given to the parent. The parent could then choose whatever school we want to send those kids to. So then they say, okay, I'm going to take that money that's set for my student, for my kid, and I'm going to go put that into a Christian school, or I'm going to go put that into a madrasa, or I'm going to put that into, strictly religious schools, or I'm going to put that into this ideology or whatever. Now you're taking funding from public schools and you're putting it into private schools, private education that doesn't follow any kind of standards. They follow some. I don't want to say that. I don't want to get into like an argument on that. They do follow standards, but you know what I mean. So that's where we're at on there. Again, look at Project 2025. It's Section 3, the General Welfare. It's Chapter 11, Department of Education. Look at, go to congress.gov and legislation, type in education, see what comes up. You have, again, introduced in November, getting rid of the Department of Education completely. Some of the people that they're talking about whenever we're trying to get, that we're going to have to go in and get Linda McMahon confirmed by the Senate. So one of the senators that is going to be in charge of making sure that she gets nominated and through the nomination process is Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana. And in January 2023, he actually introduced a bill that said, okay, so anybody, you should be able to get a tax credit for individuals to take this money for funding, for taking public school funding and put it in private schools. Any person, any eligible person, any person that makes not any household income not greater than 300% of the area's median income is available for that tax credit. Again, one of the senators that are going to be in charge of ensuring that Linda McMahon gets through nominations is a big advocate for ensuring that you get a tax credit for people that have household incomes not greater than 300% of the median income. That means that over 90% of people that don't need this tax credit, that don't need help sending their kids to private schools, that don't need that, are now going to get a tax credit to send their kid to private school that they were going to send to them anyway, but they want the government to pay for it. Meanwhile, kids that live in terrible circumstances aren't getting that money, or they're getting it through these grants that come from the federal government. And you have people now that are like, I want to send my kid to private school, but I want the government to pay for it, or don't give those kids money. That's not fair. Fair is ensuring that every single person, every single child in this country has access, 1, to food, and 2, education. And these things are tied together. one of the biggest problems that you have, well, a couple problems, right? Why the pushback? One, they're going to talk about transgender issues and how funding's tied, and you're going to, all the transgender, and they're going to take away women's sports completely. And it's the downfall of everything, right? We'll get to that. But one of the biggest problems that they have for funding comes whenever we talk about student loan forgiveness. We talk about protections for LGBT students. We talk about allowing students with disabilities to have equal access to schools. When we talk about Title IX, and that's where most of these issues arise, President Obama had issued guidance allowing for students to use the bathrooms that aligned with their gender identity, right? A lot of people got upset about that. The first Trump administration rolled back those protections. The Biden administration has put those back into place and included protections for LGBT students under sex discrimination. So Title I and Title IX now include people that are in the LGBT community. And what the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, wants to do is roll back the protections for the LGBT students. And these things are designed to protect our most vulnerable. We had a Senate hearing this week, right, where you had the NCAA president talking about different programs and different things, and it turned into every Republican senator yelling about transgender athletes. Senator Durbin asked the NCAA commissioner, how many student athletes are in the NCAA at this moment? And he said roughly 510,000. So 500,000 athletes. He said, how many transgender athletes do we have right now? He said less than 10. I understand that people have issues and that they don't fully understand things, and you have emotional responses to things that you don't understand. But again, these are kids, and you're talking about 10. And we are holding Senate hearings when other students don't have access to school. When other students, we're holding Senate hearings, we're talking about getting rid of an entire department because people are mad because a couple administrations said that it's okay if somebody wants to use the bathroom of their choice. We can have discussions on safety, but this is ridiculous. We also, you'll also hear some of the advocates again, breaking apart the Department of Education is because they said that there were strings tied to federal programs for food insecurity. So there was a change in the law saying changing the term gender to gender identity and sexual orientation, or the term sex from sex to gender orientation and sexual identity. That's it. There was school districts and states that fought against it and said, I don't want to feed the students because I don't want to change the verbiage. But what are you trying to make me do? I'd rather not feed and have the ability to feed all of our students, no matter what their parents make, all of our students. I want to provide them with breakfast and lunch every single day. Every single day, right? I want to provide them with breakfast and lunch every single day. And you had states reject it because they did not want to change the term sex to sexual orientation and gender identity. But that's going to be the big thing, right? And you can disagree with that. That's fine. But look into different ones in Wisconsin and different things like that. Different school boards, because the school boards will tell you what's actually being said. What school boards have actually said in Wisconsin and other things was during COVID, there was actually the program put in place to where everybody got food. All the students got food, and then they got food during the summer for free. I mean, yes, when I say for free, I understand that we pay for it through taxes, right? I get it. I pay for it. I want the kids to get fed. I want it. That's what I want. I want kids to get fed. I want them to not have hunger in their stomach, whether it be for breakfast or for lunch. And I want them to have the ability to go to a food pantry in their freaking school and go pick out food in case their family doesn't have food. I don't want them to have to think about that, because the more they're thinking about that, the less they're likely in the library. And when I tell you that those school boards, like the one in Wisconsin, said publicly, it will teach them, that won't teach them anything but to get a handout. You're talking about kids getting food. But they're going to blame the fact that they wanted to change the term from gender to gender identity and sexual orientation. Prevented you from providing food year-round for children. You want to play identity politics? That's what it is. That got me heated. I'm sorry. I'm just going to move right along. All right. So where can we have some common ground here? One, don't get rid of the Department of Education, right? It would take a lot to get rid of the Department of Education, but there are things that they can do in Congress, like making it with, taking away funding, taking away their ability to provide funding through Title I to Title IX, Title 11, all of those things, right? Where can we find common ground? Apprenticeship programs. So one of the big things is in 2017, Ms. McMahon, she lauded President Trump's executive order that doubled the taxpayer money allocated to Apprenticeship USA. Apprenticeship programs are so important that we want to make sure that we have it. And we have those. And like I said, I think we should expand and promote more programs for trade schools. I think that is super important. Support for, yep. Not going to get that into anymore. There's been some good things recently that have happened. There was a Republican in Indiana where it was a FAFSA deadline act, and it's HR 8932. And it makes 1 October the hard deadline for FAFSA information and funds to be allocated. And so basically it says that 1 October is the deadline for people to get in their applications. It used to have like a period until January, but that ensures that we have all of the information we need as a government to know like who is approving for it, and that the funds are available. The funds will be available on time. And if the funds do not, if there's a failure to meet the deadline or impacts of failing to meet the deadline, that the education secretary must testify in front of Congress. I think that is great, right? There's also Senate Bill 5418, and it authorized grants for training families of those affected by Alzheimer's. So Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota had put that out in place to ensure, and I don't think it got approved. I'm almost positive it didn't. But it authorizes grants. As somebody who has family's been affected by Alzheimer's and other delays, developmental delays and everything else, is I spend a lot of time looking at these things, and to have the ability to have training for families with members that are affected by Alzheimer's is huge. If you're not familiar with that, you may be doing things that may not be helping the situation. It may be hurting the situation. You might be doing your best. So in order to have training and provided training for families is super important. I think it would be important for them to understand as well. Now, you also have things like HR 10257, which was introduced by Virginia Foxx, the representative, a Republican from North Carolina. Virginia Foxx is something. She's also the leader of the Education Committee, Education Workforce Committee. If you actually go to the Education Workforce Committee website, .gov website, there's a pop-up that comes up on a .gov website that talks about President Biden's radical spending, right? But the Republicans have a solution for that. I don't think you should have a pop-up for that type of rhetoric on a .gov website, but that's just me. But she introduced a bill that says Protect an Economic Freedom Act, prohibits institutions from non-expressive commercial boycott of Israel. So that's what she's concerned with. It means a commercial action, including engaging in refusals to deal in terminating business activities that intended to eliminate commercial relations with Israel's or persons or entities doing business in Israel or in Israel-controlled territories. Basically, it says, she's basically saying that colleges, so it goes back to after October 7th, the horrible attack on Israel and Israeli citizens, completely horrible, destructive act. There was a lot of protests around colleges and college campuses, whether it be in a lot of support for Gaza, a lot of misaligned support too for terrorists, which that's a whole nother conversation with those people. But I do believe that there's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza and that there needs to be things fixed with that. But the response to all of this was for Representative Fox to say that it was restrict colleges from terminating any business with Israel. There was a lot of colleges, there was a lot of protests on colleges campus that weren't like pro-Hamas, but they were just like, hey, college that I'm paying money to, I don't want my money going to an institution that is also providing money to Israel for X, Y, and Z. Now, that is their right as a citizen and as a person whose money is going to that university, whether it be through their parents, through their grants, whatever, it's in their name, right? They have an authority, they have the ability to protest that. That's their right. But Ms. Fox put into a law making it prohibiting institution from non-expressive commercial boycott of Israel. I don't. So I guess that's where we're at on that. And then obviously Senate Bill 5384 to abolish the Department of Education. All right. So I think we are good on that. Big things, again, is I want to ensure that we are all aware that Department of Education is good. It does good things. It doesn't set curriculum for you, or go talk to your state about that if you're mad about that, right? A couple other things. While we're talking about President Trump's newly formed staff picks and everything else, I just want to point out big things. He's appointed so far 13 billionaires to take over government positions. And that's worth roughly $460 billion. And that was a few days ago. So probably more now. All right. Biden's current cabinet total is 118 million. So who do you think represents people like you? Again, I think representation matters. I think whenever we see people that look like us, when we see people that talk like us, that are from the same place as us, they understand us, right? They get it. When I talked about making land grants for colleges and universities expansive, not just in the Northeast, right? Or just in the South. We're talking about getting different perspectives from different industries, different people. That's all important, right? We want that. And it's hard to do that whenever your cabinet is full of billionaires who may not understand the struggle of everyday Americans, especially whenever they may have run off of the promise of lowering groceries because the Americans are going through a rough time, right? Just like we did in other times throughout our history. And then the first thing that they want to do is shut down the government because it won't be that big of a deal. It is a big deal to the people who whose paychecks they're relying on that, right? Who may get furloughed. I've seen people all over the internet, oh, they'll get back pay. All right. Speaking of the omnibus and of the incoming administration, a couple new picks. We got Rick Grinnell, Trump advocate, newly elected into a new position. So Trump created a new position for special missions envoy for Rick Grinnell. So that's exciting. So not only has he created now the Department of Government Efficiency, he's created a whole nother position, which is just it's just really getting rid of the swamp, right? That's what we're doing here. Devin Nunes, he was a former Congressman Nunes. He was kind of a disgraced congressman, if you really want to look at it. He sued a cow. There's somebody that was pretending to be a cow on Twitter. He's the CEO of Trump's Truth Social. He left Congress to become CEO of Trump's Truth Social, and he's going to be in charge as the chairman of Trump's Intel Advisory Board, but while also still holding on to being CEO of Trump's Truth Social. Carrie Lake, you know, that one from Arizona. Carrie Lake, who continues to lose elections and continues to election deny, is actually picked to be the Voice of America leader. Voice of America is a completely government-funded news organization that was actually created to go against Nazi propaganda. And now we have Carrie Lake is going to be the one that's going to be doing that. And the Voice of America is the one that goes internationally out. So Carrie Lake will be in charge of that. And again, it's taxpayer funded. So you got a taxpayer funded position. So Carrie Lake can make six figures doing what exactly is she going to continue to do in the swamp? And then you have Kimberly Guilfoyle, ambassador to Greece. How exciting is that for her and for America? Kimberly Guilfoyle, who's maybe she's still engaged to Donald Trump Jr. The news came out the day after he was caught holding hands with somebody else. Could that be just hey, go to Greece, have fun. Herschel Walker, ambassador to Bahamas. Yeah. Previously ran for Senate in Georgia, multiple scandals, including threatening his ex-wife and paying for an abortion, even though he ran against that a lot. Edward Sharp Wilson is the ambassador to Ireland. He's a resident of Bedminster. Yeah, that's where Trump's golf course is. Yeah, probably no issue there. Ed Martin, Office of Management and Budget. He's the chief of staff of the Office of Management and Budget. He co-authored the conservative case for Trump. Okay. He was a supporter of election fraud claims in 2020. I feel like there's something there. Attorney General for Civil Rights is Harmet Dillon. She was the former vice chair of the Republican Party in California. She represented a Google employee that was fired after he circulated a memo arguing that men are better suited for tech jobs due to biological differences over women. She helped support the push to overturn the 2020 election. And that would be the division if Senator Rounds had his way or Project 2025 had their way to take over Title I requirements for schools. If the education department was demoted or eliminated, she would be in charge of that. Okay. Social Security Commissioners, Frank, I don't know how to say his last name, but Sinano, Chairman and CEO of Financial Services Company. Okay. In 2019, Frank placed second on the highest paid CEOs with a total compensation of $102.2 million that 1 year. Mostly it was in stock options, but I'm sure he'll do well with Social Security Administration, right? His wife donated $924,600 to Trump campaigns in October. How exciting. So I'm sure all of those picks are just really, really awesome. And they're going to have everyday Americans stuff on their minds whenever they talk about that. Omnibus, quickly here. Fun stuff. I do have a couple things I just want to bring up is that the omnibus is something where they cram a whole bunch of stuff together at the end of the year to get funding approved. We're under a continuing resolution right now, meaning our government's funded because they can't come to a complete agreement on anything, so they keep coming to these piecemeal agreements. Now, these Speaker Mike Johnson had promised to never have another omnibus again. I think he even said in, what was it? Let's see here. Oh yeah, here it is. In September, we have broken the Christmas omni, and I have no intentions of going back to that terrible tradition. So there won't be a Christmas omnibus. We're not going to do any buses. And then there was buses. A lot of them. And I say that kind of funny because you're hearing a lot of rhetoric right now that talks about how they're cramming in all these things, and they'll be like and the Democrats will be like poor farmers and poor disaster relief and everything. Yes, that's absolutely true. We did put all that in there because things like disaster relief, whenever Americans were talking about, whenever it was the biggest thing that we were sending all this money to Ukraine and we're not sending any money to disaster relief, the Democrats were yelling for Speaker Johnson to put his Congress back into session to pass a standalone bill. Guess who didn't do that? The Republicans, because it was an election year. Meanwhile, they also said, oh, we're just sending a bunch of money to Ukraine, right? And you hear a lot of people even like on ESPN maybe even talking about, oh, millions versus billions, right? So as of November 27th, so a lot has happened since November 27th, but as of then, the FEMA had paid policyholders over $1.4 billion. That was November 27th. $1.4 billion. FEMA estimates that it could potentially result in just flood insurance claims between 3.5 and 7 billion. But those are those estimates from November 12th, and it'll probably change, right? But yeah, so almost a month ago, it surpassed $1 billion, but people don't look any of this up. And so they'll just go online and talk about how we need to be isolationist again. We can't help those people in Ukraine. I mean, listen to Putin. He's going to stay. He's just going to stop at Ukraine. He's just trying to take back what's his, right? This was the same thing that happened with Hitler. But here we are. Anyway, so a couple other things is there was a lot of funding in there. So there was a compromise deal. The compromise deal had a lot of things. A compromise means that you both walk away from the table unhappy at some point, but you can live with it. One of the things that you hear about is TRICARE, not allowing access to gender-affirming care for minors of service members, right? So in the compromise bill, it did allow for adults, transgender adults, to receive gender-affirming care. Now, the caveat was for minors could not receive gender-affirming care that caused castration. That was what was in the negotiated bill. Think about what you want to about transgender issues. I mean, I don't want you to think what you want to. I want you to think about it from an educated perspective, right? But that was the difference was between castration, gender-affirming care that caused castration versus for a minor versus an adult. And I think there's everybody has their own right to their own opinion. Doesn't mean you're always correct. Doesn't mean that you're not going to get shit for your opinion. But I think that there still needs to be a lot of stuff done for understanding gender-affirming castration type of care for a minor and what an age of a consent is for something like that. For any type. Anyway, I'm not going to get into it too far, but I do think that that there is a very different of a requirement and a different of understanding of versus what is gender-affirming care versus gender-affirming care that causes castration, right? So that can be looked at. So that's one of the things. One of the other things that did stay in there, the Democrats did get to stay in there, was the fact that the military can still provide travel funding for service members to get abortion, to travel to another state that they can get an abortion if they're stationed in a state that does not allow abortion care. So that is something that stayed in there. It adds the negotiated one, but bipartisan negotiated one added $100.4 billion in fresh disaster aid, right? $100.4 billion in fresh disaster aid and $10 billion in economic aid for farmers. That's what we're looking at there. It would keep the $6.2 trillion federal budget running at its normal levels. And then there was a lot of issues that arose after the fact that allowed President-elect Trump and non-elected billionaire Elon Musk to say that it wasn't a good deal and that they didn't want it and that they didn't need it and they wanted it to go away, right? One of the things I want to point out is the government's mandatory programs, which include Social Security, Medicare, retirement, and healthcare benefits, renews automatically. So they can't touch those. With those things, three things still get funded, but military pay, your government employees pay, all of that stuff is not included. So they, as of midnight tonight, they could possibly be under what's known as a furlough, or they might not do it. Anyway, another interesting key to that was Trump's renegotiated plan. So he killed the bipartisan agreement that was in place that people were going to vote for, and it was going to keep the government running at its current levels just until March, right? And then allow this other funding, right? But allow the government funding through March, where they have to renegotiate. It would allow the newly appointed Trump administration to come, or newly elected Trump administration to come in and negotiate with Congress in March. So not long after he gets into office, this new plan going forward. He wants to do it right now because then he could blame it on the Biden administration. If it doesn't go right. One of the things that he wants is to get rid of the debt ceiling. I agree with that. It's used as, it's basically saying like, if we spend all this money, right? We spend all this money. The debt ceiling's here. We have to vote to raise it to here to ensure that we're going to pay all of the bills from here to here. If we don't do that, then we default and our nation's credit goes bad. Our nation's credit goes bad around the world. The dollar is the trading piece around the world. So it's bad. It's not good. So the debt ceiling is utilized usually as a negotiation tactic and as a hostage negotiation tactic with the Republicans a lot. So it's really interesting to see Trump utilize it. I don't care. I want the government funded. I want it funded. I like the bipartisan agreement. Just fund it. You also have Republicans now yelling. I saw press conferences where some Republicans were yelling that it needed to include a border deal. You had one. Anyway, but more to come on that. I'm sure they'll put together something today, and they'll try to get it passed by the end of the weekend. But you do have billionaires that represent the Trump administration that are going all over the internet and saying, and all over anything and saying, if you don't vote our way, then we will, 1, get you out of office, 2, defund your programs, or 3, just make your life hell. So have fun with that. But on a good note, we're going to make it through. It's going to happen. And if you don't like what's happening, you know what to do. Call your senators, call your representatives, make them know that you're paying attention, that you're listening, and you don't like what's happening. Or you do. If you do, then... But anyway, I do want you to have a Merry Christmas, a Happy Holidays. I'm about to go to an F1 simulator arcade place. I love it. That's going to be a lot of fun for me today. And I just really hope you have a good holiday. So Merry Christmas.